Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am Christina Ewig. I'm the Faculty Director of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy here at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. I'd like to begin our event today first by acknowledging that we live, work, and learn each day on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary land of Indigenous peoples. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. We do a land acknowledgement at the start of all of our events for the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy as one way to educate our campus and community about this land, our relationships with it and with each other. Today, we are very pleased that you have joined us for a very timely event called Turnout, a conversation with former Minnesota Secretary of State Joan Anderson Groh and retired Star Tribune editorial writer Lori Sturtevant. Our program today will be moderated by Alana Peterson. The feature of our conversation today is a new book authored by Joan Groh with Lori Sturtevant titled Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. This book chronicles Joan Groh's political career, how she got interested in politics, became one of the early women members of the Minnesota State Legislature, and most importantly, her long career from 1975 to 1999 as Minnesota's Secretary of State. In just 19 days, our nation will have another presidential election. This is one of the most important individual decisions that Americans make every 4 years. Yet this election, even before Election Day, has been one of the most controversial in my memory with regard to whether the vote will be safe and secure and how people will have access to the vote. And these worries about access to voting during a pandemic build upon numerous other concerns about access to voting that have continued to crop up in recent years and over the decades, whether the controversy over taking voters off registration rolls during the 2018 gubernatorial election in Georgia, or more recently, the Texas state order that there will only be one ballot box per county in the current election in that state. So people across the nation continue to be concerned. Will they be able to vote? Will their vote be counted? Here in Minnesota, we are very fortunate to have excellent, well-run elections. Historically, these have been very secure, and we have had very high levels of voter access. The payoff has been that Minnesota regularly has the highest voter turnout of the nation. I saw recently on Twitter that our current Secretary of State Steve Simon tweeted that over 1.3 million Minnesotans have applied to vote from home this election, and over 600,000 of those ballots have already been accepted. Much of the credit for this easy access to voting and the cultivation of a culture of political participation in the state of Minnesota goes to Joan Groh and her work when she was Minnesota Secretary of State. Joan Groh was the longest serving Secretary of State in Minnesota history, and also one of the first women to win a Minnesota she was also the first woman to win a Minnesota statewide election in her own right. She was raised in Buffalo, Minnesota, and a graduate of St. Cloud University, and she has been a longtime friend of the Humphrey School and a member of the Humphrey School's Advisory Board. She's also a longtime friend of the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy. And on a personal note, one of the very first individuals in the broader Twin Cities area to reach out to me and offer a warm welcome when I first started as director of this center. And I continue to appreciate her friendship. Lori Sturtevant is a retired Star Tribune columnist. She worked for the Star Tribune for 43 years, having retired in 2018, but still writes on occasion for the newspaper. She spent 26 of those 43 years as a weekly columnist and editorial writer focused on Minnesota government and politics. And while she has covered all aspects of politics and government, I think it's worth pointing out that she could also be counted on to include writing about issues critical to women and about women in politics in the state. And I, for one, have been thankful for those contributions. Lori is also the author of several books focused on Minnesota history. Our moderator today is another phenomenal woman, Alana Peterson. Peterson is a political strategist and board chair of Women Winning. She has worked for over 25 years as political strategist and spent 20 years working for the US House and Senate. Most recently, she was Senator Tina Smith's Deputy Chief of Staff and coordinated the Tina Smith for Minnesota campaign. Alana Peterson has been part of Minnesota elections since 1998, when she worked on Congressman David Ming's re-election campaign. So again, welcome. Let me make one procedural note before I hand over the conversation to Alana. You will note that the chat is disabled, but we do invite your questions. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions of the speakers. Our moderator, Alana Peterson, will check these questions throughout our conversation and do her best to present these questions to our guests during the conversation. With no further ado, let me turn it over to you, Alana. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Humphrey School and the Center on Women, Gender, and Public Policy for hosting this discussion. I'm thrilled to be here not only as a student currently at the Humphrey, also in Professor Ewig's class, but also with Joan Grow and Laurie Strudevant today to talk about their new book, Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. That's true. Joan did that, you guys. This is really exciting. I, like so many, have admired both Laurie's career as a columnist and editorial writer. We can really trust Laurie to be direct, thorough, and often hard-hitting, something we have grown to really appreciate. Laurie has been writing about Minnesota politics since 1978, just shortly after Joan was first elected. Joan Grow has been a friend, a mentor, and an inspiration to me throughout my political career, as she has been for so many women. So thrilled to be with her. She is smart, she is tough, she's courageous, and she's sassy. I enjoy hearing her stories and strategizing about our current election cycle, and appreciate her passion for helping women get elected to office. Joan believes that voting is a right, not a privilege. Matter of fact, she said, if one believes that voting is a right, it follows that few but any circumstances should disqualify a citizen from eligibility to vote. She follows that by stating, election policy should aim to facilitate voting, not impede it. Her values have been the backdrop of Minnesota's rich political engagement, and this book does not disappoint. I enjoyed reading it and knowing so many people in it and having a conversation, and look forward to our discussion. A discussion we are having virtually from our homes as America deals with a pandemic and an election that is taking place in 18 days. An election many argue is the most important election of our lifetime. Welcome, Joan and Laurie. Tell me, how did you decide to partner on this book together?
Well, for me, and Laurie has really the real story, but over the years, if I've talked to groups, especially young people or young women or something, I would tell some stories about what it was like in the olden days, and somebody would say, oh, you should write that down. You should write a book. And I think, yeah, well, I can't get organized to do that. So Laurie, I'll hand it back to you.
Well, I love to write memoirs with a message. That's my favorite kind of book, and I've been involved in a bunch of them for Minnesotans of note. And so Joan and I had sort of casually talked to each other over the years, just in passing about, wouldn't it be fun to collaborate on a book someday? Then came my retirement in December of 2018, and soon thereafter I had a call from one of the officials at Minnesota Historical Society Press who said, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage is coming up. Have anything that might fit with that theme? I said, I think I've got just the thing. So Joan and I got busy and cranked it out in a little bit faster time than I thought we could have. And here it is. We were able to launch the book on Women's Equality Day this year, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment.
And we did rush.
What a great way to mark that, right? As we all,
Yeah.
with a little bit of rushing. And then we start voting just almost a month after that. We all started voting in September. So we thank you for that, Joan, and getting us voting. But Laurie, tell us, you were around as the history and Joan's story was unfolding. What was the most surprising thing you learned in your research?
Well, that's a good question, Alana. You know, you mentioned as you introduced me that I started covering state politics in 1978, which was a big election year in Minnesota. But for Joan, it was her second time. She was seeking re-election for the first time in 1978, having won the Secretary of State's office 4 years earlier in 1974, when I was still a kid in Iowa, going to college at Coe College. So I was not aware of the big difference that she made and her election made for the Secretary of State's office. When I was digging around in the papers at the Historical Society's, the History Center's library, I came across a memo from a fellow named Forrest Talbot, who had been the Assistant Secretary of State for 12 years, ending in 1971. He opined that the most important role of the Secretary of State's office was as the keeper of the state's history, its archivist, and also the determiner of the proper uses of the state seal. Well, let me tell you, that was a far cry from the vision Joan Grow brought to that office as someone administering the state's first requirement for a statewide voter registration system, which actually was passed by the 1973 legislature. We did not have statewide voter registration in Minnesota until 1973. That was news to me. And the making of that system, while it was sort of begun by her predecessor, Republican Arlen Erdahl, it really took off in earnest when Joan took that office in January of 1975.
That is great. And Joan, when you stepped into that, was the office what you expected, or?
Well, I don't think you ever know what you're getting into sometimes, but it was and it wasn't. As Lori said, the major election bill had been passed in 1973, and it really brought in multiple changes, not just statewide voter registration, but you could vote, you could register by mail, you could register in person on election day. And what you're really dealing with are county auditors and city clerks all across the state of Minnesota, who many of them had never had voter registration rolls to begin with. And so we found ourselves in a real position to go out and help people, I guess you could say. People were curious about me. They wanted to come out and see what I was like if I knew what I was talking about. And we had all these new laws to implement for the next election. And so the first thing we did is my elections director, Mary Ann McCoy, a former president of the League of Women Voters, and I drove around the state holding meetings with auditors, with city clerks, with election judges, even township officials, where we would expect maybe 25 people to come to the meeting, and we'd end up overcrowding the gymnasium. You know, there'd be 100 or 200 people. They were really curious, I think, to see what a woman Secretary of State looked like. But they also came to learn some things. And it was just a fascinating experience for me. And we learned what they needed to do their job correctly. We certainly heard a lot about what they didn't like about that law, because it was new, could be complicated, and it was a lot more work. And so when we would strategize at the office, we decided that we needed to get those local election officials on our side so that they would feel free to talk to us, we could talk to them, and we could give them whatever kind of assistance they needed. So it was really an interesting first travel experience as Secretary of State around the state of Minnesota and all the different people that we met and learned from.
That is great. And I'm sure they had just enjoyed getting to know you, and you probably still to this day have many friends around the state. But
well,
talk about your family and your values.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a small town.
Go ahead, Joan.
And my dad was the mayor and my mom was a retired nurse. And I remember my dad, I never saw campaign literature. I never saw him campaign actually, but I knew he ran for office and they voted. They were adamant about talking about going to vote. But my dad, because he was the mayor, because it was a small town, if we'd be walking down the street, people would stop and talk to him or tell him about a problem. And the phone always, as my mother said, always rang the minute we sat down for dinner. You know, somebody's cat was up in a tree or someone to talk about a new road or whatever it might be. And my dad was always, he was so patient and so gracious. And that was really my first, I guess, exposure to a level of government. I will say this, I thought only men were in public office because I didn't know of or had never seen a woman in public office. And in fact, people in town used to say, if my brother and I were there, they used to say, well, Bill, I suppose you're going to go run for office like your dad. And he'd mumble some answer, and they never, ever suggested it was me who might run for office. But from there, I went on to state-supported school. That's what my family could afford. And I became a teacher. And I think it was 2 weeks after I graduated from college, which I did in like 3 years instead of 4. So I could, I don't know what I was hurrying for, but I got married. And I had a job teaching. And my husband was going to what is now the University of St. Thomas. He was a senior. And so I worked so that he could continue going to college. Well, then after college, he went to the University of Minnesota Law School, which was another 3 years. And I worked sporadically when I could, but at the same time in those 3 years, we had 3 children. We had 3 children within 2 years, in fact, no twins. But I think I really couldn't wait till he graduated, passed the bar. We could go out and kind of live a semi-normal life. So after that happened, we went to move to his hometown of Tracy, Minnesota. And we had a little house and we had the children, and I got to know some of the people in town. But my husband was not the person I thought he was. It turned out that he was an alcoholic, and he was extremely abusive, and he didn't work because he was unable to work. And it turned out to be a really frightening experience that I had never seen or heard of before. So one day I just decided that for my own safety and the safety of my kids, we were going. And so I picked up and came back to the Twin Cities, looked for a job, realized I hadn't kept my teaching certificate up to date. And finally, one of the nuns at a parochial school hired me. She didn't care that my credentials were not up to date, as long as I did a good job of teaching. And she paid me that amazing sum of $300 a month, no benefits. And that was fine. That worked out for the year I was there. But I realized I had to make more money than that. I mean, I've got 3 growing kids. So I went back to the University of Minnesota at night. I upgraded my teaching certificate, and I was thrilled when I got a job at the St. Anthony School District to teach children there the following year. But it's getting to be a long story, I'm sorry. But there was one major problem, and that was school ended in May, so my last paycheck came in May. School didn't start until September when the next paycheck came, and I had no money. We could not save a lot on $300 a month, the 4 of us. And I didn't know what to do, and someone suggested that I go to the Hennepin County Welfare Office for AFDC, which was Aid to Families with Dependent Children. I think it has a different name now. And I thought, I have no choice. So I did, and I will just say this, I was grateful at the time for the aid, but it was incredibly embarrassing and a humiliating situation. I remember we lived near Central Avenue, and there was must have been a social service office on Central, and we lined up on the sidewalk, all these women who needed assistance, and we go in and they'd give you free, like huge bags of rice or other grains that I didn't even know what they were or what to do with them, but there we were with our kids hanging on our skirts, and I think that's the one vision I have of it. But luckily, I went to work in the fall. And when I look back on it years later, I realized that if it hadn't been for that government help, I would not have made it. I mean, we would have been homeless. We would have been in really dire straits. And I was grateful for that aid. And so I like to remember and think throughout my life that there are times when the government is really helpful to people. And I like to think it's most of the time, but we need that structure and we need to think about that. And I think that gave me a huge appreciation for what government can do.
Yeah, I also appreciated the story you told about your dad thinking about supporting you as you went through your various stages in life. And one of them, when you were running, right, that he would walk around and say, "I'm Art Anderson, my daughter is Joan Grow. I hope you vote for me," right, around the Minneapolis.
Yes.
He was walking around Nicollet or something on your behalf.
He was so enthused about it that they used to come into town, as we called it, from Buffalo once a week, and my mother would go shopping or whatever. And when I wasn't busy, I would have lunch with her. But my dad would go to the campaign office and he'd get stacks of literature, and he'd walk down the street and say, just what you said, "I'm Art Anderson. This is my daughter. She's running for Secretary of State." And I met people years later who said, "Oh, I met your dad on Nicollet Avenue." So he was an enthusiastic supporter, I will say.
I was so pleased when we found a picture of
That's
Dad
great.
swearing you in as Secretary of State in January of 1975 that we could use in the book, along with your son, Michael, holding the Bible or whatever book you used there as part of that swearing in ceremony. A neat picture of 3 generations, and your dad was quite an influence on you.
He really was, yes. So that was nice. Yeah.
As you started to get active on the Vietnam War and supported Eugene McCarthy, was your dad also standing next to you then? And how did you get, tell us more about these events and the time period that inspired you to become more politically active?
Well, I was remarried by this time, had another son, and I joined the League of Women Voters. And that was really, for a suburban homemaker with 4 children, it was really nice, because when the older kids were at school, I could take the baby and go off to league meetings. But I was appointed the voter service chair, which meant that I was in charge of putting together the local debates and trying to get people registered. And I became very familiar with the problems. At that time, you had to go to City Hall in person between certain hours and register if you wanted to vote. Well, we talked our city clerk into letting us register voters in the fall at the PTA meetings. And it was a huge, big deal. There was even a picture in the paper, because this was quite the news. We had to be sworn in to uphold the law, but it was so successful. I think that set a tone for me, knowing that people like some convenience. And then this was, of course, the Vietnam War period. And I was incredibly opposed to the war. And I hadn't really been active in politics. But those of us who were opposed to the war, the Democratic caucuses at the time were winner take all. We had no mercy. I mean, we had no mercy. We organized and we got enough people to go so that the anti-war people took over the caucuses where I lived then in Burnsville. And then when we moved to Minnetonka, it was in 1972, when the election came up, when I ran for the legislature, that then it was a time that the parties were trying, especially the Democrats, they were trying to get more women in positions of elected office within the party. And it had always been the women who did the bake sales and raised the money and were the associate chairs. So they were finally working to get them to be the chairs. So we actually ended up organizing the women in Minnetonka and Eden Prairie to go to their political caucus and be part of the power. And I think there was a requirement at the time that they had to be. So.
That's great. I can imagine you with that Mother for Peace badge around your neck, sort of a inspiration.
I did another Mother for Peace, which I still have that little medal. I wore that for years, and we would boycott this company or the other company and go with my kids to the grocery store, and I had my list. of what not to buy because they were really supporting the war. Kids would whine over something and we'd go, no, let's see, we've got to get a different brand, you know, but, and marching and protesting. It was, I mean, I had these 3 sons, and I mean, 2 of them were in junior high, and I thought, wow, you know, I don't want them going off to fight this war, and I got to do something about it. And that's, I think, how I became more of an activist, really, was through that movement, which mostly young people today don't even remember it.
And then if we turn towards your run for Senate in you ran against Rudy Boschwitz for US Senate. And the book points out at the time there were only 28 female legislators, 2 female associate Minnesota Supreme Court judges, 4 of the 87 county attorneys, 6% of county commissioners, and only 5% of the mayors identified as female. And you were running for the US Senate on the ballot, at least with Geraldine Ferraro, right? But tell us a little bit more about running statewide as a woman in 1984.
Well, it was a tough haul, I will say. Number one, we knew it was an uphill battle running against an incumbent. At least I knew that. But I had wonderful campaign staff, wonderful folks helping me, and I traveled all around the state. We were outspent quite a bit. Lori kind of remembers those figures, but it was different because people would often say to me, well, now, what are you doing about your children? And I'd say, well, they're in school, you know, and I have childcare or have help with their children, but people couldn't place, I think, a woman in the US Senate. There weren't any role models. And so that was hard. They'd ask me, what's it like running as a woman? And they'd ask me, are you tough enough? And I'd say, well, this is reporters too, other than Lori, but this is reporters because, and I'd say, well, this isn't a physical contest. You know, this is a different kind of contest. But I talked later and said to Lori, I wish I had known Pat Schroeder's answer when she was asked, what's it like to be a woman running for president? And she said, gosh, I didn't know I had any other options. And I thought, there's a good answer, but I didn't think about it. So it was hard to overcome that initial hesitation because they weren't sure that's where women belonged. And then secondly, I didn't have a woman to look to see how you dressed or how you talked. And, you know, they always say that women, when they raise their voices, they're shrill and men are just strong. And there's a total double standard about a woman in that day. And I think in some degree, in some offices, it's still there today. You know, they used to comment about what I was wearing, but they didn't comment about the men. And every once in a while they'd say, well, Secretary Groh looked very tired on the trail. I thought, well, I suppose I'm working 20 hours a day. I should look tired, but the men never looked tired. It used to be so frustrating to me. And I think I said it to Lori and some other reporters, and Lori was covering me then. That was when we first met, Lori, I think, wasn't it? I said after the campaign to reporters who came in the office, I said, because I was more relaxed then probably also, and I knew them better, I said, you know, if I had known that you guys knew so little about women running for office, I would have called you in here before I even started running, and I would have said, okay, ask all the dumb questions. Ask, you know, how the kids feel about this. Is this a lot of work? Is this stressful? Are you strong enough? The one question that was so factual that drove me just crazy was the fact that raising money is a test of the validity of your candidacy. And there were 4 candidates in that race: Oberstar, Wendell Anderson, and John Deris. And I consistently, from the very beginning, raised more money than any of the other candidates. And it was reported, they could see it, and they'd still say to me, do you think you could raise enough money? So it was those discouraging signs that I hope are not there now for women. And I don't think they are to that degree. I mean, I look at the way other women now, like Angie, Betty McCollum, I mean, they're accepted, that nobody thinks anything about it. But it was a learning experience, but I also learned a lot about the state and made a lot of friends, and it's not a race I really regret, but it was hard losing. I mean, I expected to lose. I did not think we could win, even though we thought we were riding on Mondale's coattails. They weren't quite long enough, big enough for it. And the one thing that, and it was hard for my supporters, and it was hard for the workers, and it was hard for my kids and my family and my parents, but it wasn't the hardest thing I'd ever lived through. So for me, other than having a debt and being exhausted, it didn't have that feeling like my life is over. And I learned one thing, and one thing I was very pleased about is a couple of days after the election, the St. Paul paper printed some story about it. And they said, well, Grow lost the election. She was a winner for women. And I thought, yes, you know, that's what I want to do too, is encourage and help other women to run. But it took how many years, Lori, before Amy was elected?
Another 22 years. 22
years. So I guess I was really ahead of my time, and there were a couple of tries in between, but it took Amy 22 years to get Amy elected to the U.S. Senate. And we've yet to elect a female governor. So when Margaret was running, her campaign staff got hold of a book that Barbara Stuhler had written about my campaign. And it noted all these things that, you know, differentiated how women were treated and men. And a couple of the young ones came to me and they said, Joan, nothing's changed. They're saying that to Margaret too. Well, progress is very slow. So patience, I guess, is what it is. But.
And Lori, you covered her on that race, and you did an exclusive with her in that race in June, right? Did the press treat her differently, or than they did the male figure she was running against? Or?
Well, I definitely, I can attest to the accuracy of what Joan remembers about all the strange and slightly sexist, maybe more than slightly sexist questions she would get. But what I think about when I think about the coverage of that race are more the sins of omission than of commission by fellow journalists and fellow news organizations. To the credit of the Star Tribune, I was the state politics reporter then, and I was assigned pretty exclusively to covering that race. It was the only statewide race that year, and it was a race that my newspaper took seriously. And we were the biggest news organization in the state, had more staff so we could afford to do this probably. But I was assigned full time to covering that race. And so we gave it rather extensive coverage and cared about the policy pronouncements, wrote a lot about Joan's calls for nuclear weapons freeze and about her positions on issues like Social Security, issues like healthcare. We wrote about issues, not just about the color of her dress that day. That coverage, the extent of that coverage really was not typical of other news organizations in Minnesota. May I say, not typical today either. We still, I don't think, are covering issues the way we should in some of these statewide races that are very important. So that would be how I would reflect on that. Joan's campaign was thoroughly covered, but not by every news organization.
Yeah, it was interesting to read in the book about the different places where even during that convention, the idea that Oberstar sort of said you lacked in substance as you went into that, and some of the just fights you had to get through those 22 ballots, right, in the end of that convention. So,
and people,
very interesting fight you had, and so glad you prevailed there.
Thank you, and that was the first time, and I think the only time, that there's been a statewide DFL convention held that they haven't had a drop-off rule. where the person who finally comes in last after a couple of three ballots has to leave the race so that their ballots are distributed to the rest of the people. There was no drop-off rule, which meant all four candidates stayed in that race for a very long time. And I was always leading towards the 60%. Overstar was very close behind. And Wendell and John Darris were way down at the bottom. And they'd have maybe 8 to 12% of the vote. Finally, John Darris, as I recall, dropped out. But it was finally our party chair, Mary Monahan, called us all in the back room. And she said, you can bring one person with you. Well, I took my wonderful campaign director at the time, Ted Grindle, with me. And Ted was young. He was a young lawyer. And he had organized what I thought was just a superb convention organization. And it was. I mean, it worked. We were ahead. So we went in the back room with the other candidates who, in many cases, had brought a couple of people. And they had people back there like Martin Sabo and Dave Rowe and David Lebedoff, some of the old party, you know, so-called wisdom people. And they all kind of stood around for a minute. And then it's a party chair's job to try to come up with a candidate. That's what you want, is to come out with one candidate so you don't have a messy primary. And instead, it was their suggestion that I drop out. And I thought, I looked around and I said, but I have the most votes. Why should I drop out? Well, if you drop out, the rest of us will drop out, I guess was the story. And of course, we've been going, this must have been, we started Saturday morning, we went all day Saturday, all Saturday night with no break. Delegates never use their hotel rooms. This is sometimes Sunday morning, so probably we're not thinking or talking straight by this time. And I know I was hoarse. And I said, no. And I can't remember, I think we went back in the room and finally, they just were kind of beating on us. We've got to all drop out. There are people out there who are ill. There are people who need to go home. There are older people. And I guess we finally agreed to that. So I went up to the podium. They had me go first. That's the first time they acknowledged that I was ahead. I think I went up first and said, I gave my word and I'll keep my word and I am withdrawing. And the idea was then we were all going to be in a primary. Well, Mary Ellen Tisdale, who was a delegate, got up in the middle of the convention and she asked for recognition. The chair recognized her and she said, this convention belongs to the delegates. It does not belong to the candidates. It's always belonged to the delegates. And I move we continue voting. And at that point, there'd been a vote while we were in the back room. I was just almost ready to go over the top, the 60%. Everybody cheered and yelled and they voted one more time. I'm in the back room again with my staff and family. Some of them are crying, some are swearing, they're just, people are grieving, thinking, how are we going to do this multiple primary? And George Latimer came running in the door and he'd been listening on the radio at home. And he said, Joan, I'm not going to quote him directly, Joan, get off that chair and get up there and accept the endorsement, which I did. So it was messy, but we prevailed. And ultimately, after those 3 weeks it took before Overstar and Wendell decided they weren't going to run, but it did take them a while to decide. And one of Overstar's staff members said to a staff member of mine, he said, this was really hard for Jim. He didn't like losing to a woman. And I thought that does say something about the time, I guess. But then we ended up with the primary anyway with Bob Matson, whose dad had been Attorney General and had a good name, but we won that. So it was a long, long, complicated race.
Yes, it was. And at the end of it, the DSCC asked you to come to DC and talk a little bit about what you had learned and give them some lessons. And the story in the book outlines that Ellen Malcolm was in that audience, right? And so later started Emily's List. And so can you tell us a little bit, what kind of feedback did you give that room when you were
it
brought
was
out to DC to talk about that race.
it was an intimidating group because, oh shoot, what's the, what was the senator's name from who went over to barter the peace process in Ireland? I can't think of.
George
Who?
Mitchell?
George Mitchell was taking over as chair of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, and from a Texas senator. And he really wanted to figure out why or what people could do to help women candidates. And then all the women, including Ellen Malcolm, women who had supported me throughout the race from Washington, the teachers groups, some of the labor groups, some of the social workers groups, just kind of the political women in Washington. So we all got together, and in '84, I think there were 4 or 5 women running for the United States Senate on the Democratic side around the country. And I was the one who was pegged as having the best chance. Well, we all lost, but they wondered how could we help? And I gave the feedback, and one of them was, you know, women have to be twice as good to win. You have to have twice as much energy, twice as much money, and everything else at this time, because you're not judged on an even level. So Ellen, from that, took that to heart and started Emily's List, which is early money is like yeast. So, and we've remained cohorts over the years, and it's grown to a wonderful, wonderful organization that does give women a burst of funding early on in the campaigns when they're working to try to establish themselves as a viable candidate.
That's right. Now here we are in 2020, and they've got a record number of women that they've endorsed, and women winning here in Minnesota has 25 women for the Minnesota Senate and 50 for the Minnesota House that they've endorsed, and women are running up and down the ballot, and we have 2 women senators who are as senators and 1 running for re-election, right? That's a lot of change from when you started in 72 to 84 to when you ran.
Yes.
And for both of you, like, what do you think's changed, and what role do you think some of those organizations played in that?
I'll just comment that I was present at the press conference that announced the formation of the Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund in 1982. And as I think back on that press conference, one of the changes is obvious. That was a group that was started almost 50-50 by Republican and Democratic women, DFL women. And today, Women Winning, while it still is officially nonpartisan because it has a strong abortion rights, pro-choice position, it has become largely a DFL women's organization. That was not intentional. It didn't have to go that way, but because the rules of the 2 parties differed in the way that they did, the anti-abortion activists gravitated into the Republican Party and felt, I must say, increasingly unwelcome in the DFL. So we wind up having a strong, still, Women Winning now the name of the old Minnesota Women's Campaign Fund, but it winds up being a much more partisan group. And that's one of the things that has changed in all of our politics, an overlay of much sharper partisan division that I think gets in the way in some respects of the success of women. As it has been the case in Minnesota that DFL women have been more successful than Republican women in attaining office. It's not a total story it's not totally lopsided, but that is the case. And it's telling today that we have a DFL House Speaker in the person of Melissa Hortman at the Minnesota Legislature.
And I think at least my Republican friends who were active at the time, and even a couple of them who were holding office they have not felt comfortable in their party right now, and they've really kind of given up. So it's really too bad, because we used to have a camaraderie actually of the women in the legislature. After a few years, we used to do, I used to host a meeting every year at the beginning of the year with all the women in the legislature. Republicans, Democrats, we used to go out, I can't remember, probably someone purchased our lunch, I don't know, but it was legal then. Anyway, they sponsored us. And we would go down to the St. Paul, what was that building called now next to the, where the opera is, St. Paul Club? Come on.
The Minnesota Club.
Minnesota Club. Thank you, Lori. I said, and we'd go down to the Minnesota Club, which used to be, I think, all male. And the first time we did it, I think we had 2 carloads of people going down there. And I used to check with the speaker and the majority leader in the Senate to say, this is the day that, you know, we would like to go down for lunch. And so there won't be any women here, and I want you to know. And so they would accommodate us. It was really fun. The last time we went for lunch, I can't remember the year, but we had a bus, and the bus was full, and some people went in cars, and the room was just enormous. And it was so fun to look out on that room and just see all these women in office. They didn't always agree, but there were so many ways in which they connected and we could connect as women. So it was really a growth sprinting period at that time.
Yes, we'll see if we have several buses after November, right? And potential of even a vice president. We'll see.
Right. Yeah.
That's, you know, I've gotten a couple questions here, so I'm gonna remind people that you can put a question in the question and answer, but we're moving into a little bit of want to hear about what you making voting accessible. I wore my I voted sticker today as a part of that. I know the sticker was even something that was a part of a push from your office, which we, you know, cherish our stickers actually. And I think even Ramsey County now prints buttons as a part of that to honor that. But
someone told me
yes.
that they've
so
got
Joan,
stickers for kids now that say, when kids come to the polling places, that say kids vote. So getting them ready to go vote. I love it.
That's great. So the question I have for you that's come from our audience is, Joan, what advice would you give secretaries of state in states where the legislatures of governors have managed to play politics with the right to vote?
Wow. You know, I think that is becoming true in most states now. I think they've become very partisan politics. I guess I would say that you have to have your own philosophy. You have to have the philosophy of thinking that voting is a right. And you have to instill that in everyone you can. And you just have to kind of fight back against it. I was just appalled that the governor in Texas said that they could have only 1 drop-off box in each county. And some of those counties are hundreds and hundreds of miles large. I mean, that's just ridiculous to think that can happen. You're cutting off people's access to the ballot. You need strong laws, and sometimes that's very hard. I always told people that elections become the most controversial thing on the floor of the House or Senate because every single legislator believes they're an expert on elections. They all got elected under the current system. And I guess the most natural thought is when they look at a change is, how will this impact my election? So it's a lot of work to pass election laws, and you have to build up a base of people who are supportive, and you have to do a lot of educating. It is not an easy job now, especially with the lawsuits coming day after day, it seems. I'm not envious of current secretaries of state, and I think our current Secretary of State, Steve, is doing a great job. But every time you turn around, you're faced with another lawsuit, and you just have to have the confidence of all the election administrators in the state. And we, the citizens, should actually have confidence in them. Those election judges who work long hours for us, the city clerks, the county auditors, I mean, they are our neighbors, they're our friends, sometimes they're even our relatives. And I think we should appreciate the fact that what they want is for us to have a safe and secure election.
Joan just touched on something that's really important about Minnesota's success with elections, and that is that these elections are very much grassroots, locally administered enterprises with a lot of our friends and neighbors. 30,000 or more people run elections in Minnesota. It's very hard with that many eyes that are intentionally bipartisan on the polls. With that many eyes on the polls, it's very hard for shenanigans to occur at the polling place. And with our good system of tracking ballots that have been mailed or dropped off, it's very hard, I think, too, for those ballots to in any way be hijacked. I think people can feel quite confident in Minnesota that they can vote securely and that their votes indeed will be counted. An important decision, too, that was made during Jones years is that we will have a replicable paper ballot system so that our votes can be recounted. We will not rely on electronic systems that can be hacked. That's why we, to this day, have paper ballots that are scanned optically rather than voting on a touchscreen.
For a short, brief moment, Tom Durand, who was our office manager, and Joe Mansky, who was the elections director, and I were intrigued by a piece of voting equipment that didn't have a paper ballot that you could put out in different, like grocery stores or libraries or something. For one wee moment, I think we were intrigued, and then we said, no, there's no paper ballot. And I think that was our blessing, was making that decision really firm.
That's right. As you bring up Tom Durand, we did have a comment here in the question and answer, maybe a comment and a question, but so much of your staff came from Anoka County. It says Corinne Horville, Elaine Voss, and Tom Durand. What was there about Anoka County that brought those great people to you?
Well, they'd had a lot of experience, and I think I had hired Elaine. I can't remember who I hired first.
Tom
or Elaine.
Tom.
It was Tom, and he was recommended to come, I don't know how we found him, maybe by Gordy or Elaine Voss. And then we got Elaine, and then people who would talk to people in the office about jobs, they'd say, thank goodness, they'd say, well, this is a good place to work, and we like working here. We had just a tremendous staff, I must say. Joe Mansky came from Chicago, mind you, but we let him in. And he really dug into it. But the only reason that we could do as much as we could in the office was really because of Joe and Elaine and Tom. And then I had a wonderful administrative assistant, Rich Peets, who was there, and Jeannie McGree, who was a secretary for a while. But we had a close unit, and people stayed for a long time. There really wasn't much turnover. The brutal part of running an office is that when the budget gets cut by the legislature, or there's a deficit in the state, they take money away. And the hardest thing I ever did, I think, was having to let people go. But most of the time we did well, and we had a lot of young women in there because there was a lot of clerical work. And I remember there was one young woman, and she had, I think, started working there right out of high school. And she took her job about 4 months before I came into the office. So I thought, well, maybe. So I was sitting next to her one day. I came in with the idea that maybe I should learn how to do the Uniform Commercial Code filings and the corporate filings and the rest of it. I kind of gave up on that. I didn't learn it very well, but I learned the principles, and I thought she was really good. And there was a retirement. And so I went to her and I said, you are now going to be the supervisor. Oh no, she said, no, I don't want to be the supervisor. I said, why not? Well, she said, I don't know how. I said, yes, you do. I've been watching you. You know how. You're very good. You're conscientious. Well, we had a little argument back and forth. And finally I said, all right, do it for a month, Kathy, just for a month. If you don't like it, you can have your old job back. Okay, she said she would. Well, when I went back to a retirement party, and Kathy was very young at that time, a few years ago for someone in the office, Kathy was now the person who was head of the entire corporate division. So it was just, I just was thrilled to see these young women succeed also where they wanted to and where they could. Yeah. it was a great office. I'm very grateful to Minnesota for electing me and allowing me to serve, and actually for being so welcoming when I traveled around the state. We used to travel on a low budget for campaigning, and we'd stay in people's homes, and I've slept in the same room with their kids, the dog in one case, and the driver would be in the basement with the mice or whatever the occasion was, and they'd wake us really early in the morning so we could talk over breakfast. But in some of those people, when my kids traveled for me, I'd still get a note a few years later asking about, did David ever get his tie back that he left at our house? And so it really connected me, I guess, on a personal level to people in state. It was maybe not as easy or private or comfortable as staying in a hotel room, especially with the dog, I remember, although I like dogs. But it was a way to get to know people around the state. And I was truly grateful for those people. Some of them would pack us a lunch for the next day and put gas in the car because we were running on such a small budget. It was really fun. Yeah.
Hey, I think we've got probably for 2 more questions here then, and one will be just talking to you a little bit about this election and how you guys are planning to vote and what that same day registration means for us. But I do have a question that about about our collective responsibility as white women to support underrepresented sisters in politics and as leaders, and sort of what your thoughts are on that. I'd say for the folks in the audience, you read the book too, you'll read a little bit about Joan's travel around the world, including with NBI and elections. And so being in South Africa for Nelson Mandela's election is part of her work too. So you can read a little bit about that. But Joan or Lori, thoughts on how we as women support underrepresented sisters in politics?
Lori, you want to go ahead or you want me to?
Well, I'm thinking about this, you know, I still, and Joan too, strongly believe in the power of representative democracy in the strong participatory democracy that we have in Minnesota. So I'm a big believer in encouraging the groups that have been underrepresented and have been on the losing end of systemic racism in our state, to encourage them to take full advantage of the representative democracy opportunity that we have. It's been a joy to see more women of color running and winning office. And we've seen a surge of that in the legislature, overdue. Surge of that also in local governments. Recognizing those women, supporting them, encouraging them is something that Joan has done almost instinctively now for a half a century. All of us, in thinking about carrying on her legacy, those of us who are working in and around politics, and including people in my line of work too, who have the ability to shine a spotlight on those women, we should be doing that. It's something that it's long overdue and ought to come.
Yeah. And I think that women who have been underrepresented, women of color, and even in many cases you have rural women, et cetera, I think they're better organized, and they've gotten assistance from groups and from people. I can remember speaking to groups with a lot of women of color in it and talking about what they needed to do, where they should start, how we can help. And then I rarely, this is just my quirk, but I rarely, in the days when I had a PAC as Secretary of State and it was legal for me to give money to candidates, I only gave to women. I thought, I remembered how hard it was for me to raise money. And I only gave to women, and I only gave to women who were basically not incumbents unless they were in a tough race, because incumbents usually have an easier time raising money. And I still feel that way in many ways. I mean, when I'm giving, and I'm still trying to help raise money and giving money, I try to give it to people who I think are going to have the hardest time getting that funding, or door knocking for them, or going and doing a fundraiser or something. And that's just kind of a standard. But I think this year is going to be quite exciting. There are, and I haven't met all of them, but I soon will. I saw some of them. I belong to the Women's Forum, or the Women's Salon, which is current elected women in the legislature and county boards, I think. And then there's a few of us old timers that they let back in the group. And we've tried to get out of it, but they won't let us out. But it's so fun when they had the introduction to the new candidates to see all of the women of different ages also. I mean, you know, it was kind of shocking when we ran because most women who had run were older. I mean, I think I was 40 when I first ran, and Linda Berglund, who was elected that year, had to have been in her late 20s. I can't remember.
7, yes.
I mean, we had a wide range of women from the inner city to the suburbs to, you know, and it'll be so fun this year because I think they're going to have the largest number of women of color, and maybe, I assume people of color also, but women of color in the legislature. And from what I hear, there's a couple of really bright stars coming in, and I just love to see that. I love to see what they can do and to give them an opportunity to be part of it. And it's only right that we start to do that.
Well, I know we're hitting the hour, but I think we should end on just hearing from both of you on either of you voted already or your current plans to vote, if you could share with us.
Lori, go ahead.
Well, it has been kind of contrary to my longstanding belief that I vote early. I have always argued on the Star Tribune editorial board that campaigns matter. I believe in covering campaigns, so they better matter. And so I was always an advocate to vote on election day and to make endorsement decisions as late as possible. So this year I'm violating my own rules. I have voted, I have tracked my ballot, it's all set.
Well, and we ordered absentee ballots this year, and we put our ballot in the mail for the primary. And then we made up our mind fairly early also this year. And we filled out the ballots, and I said, no, we're not going to mail them. And actually, I do have faith in our letter carriers, and I have faith in our local post office. I just don't trust the guys way on top. So I decided, and we went down to Hennepin County the other day. They have a drive-in drop-off box, and I thought we didn't have to get out of the car. We just drove up. Nice person. I don't know if it's a volunteer or paid, appropriate jacket, came out, took our ballot, and he opened it because we weren't mailing it. So he took the mailing envelope off and looked at it to be sure that we had filled out everything we needed to fill out, which I was grateful for because, you know, you look at it and think, could I do something so foolish as to forget to sign my name? They were in good shape. He took the ballots. He handed us a little piece of paper with the internet on it so that we could track our ballot, gave us our I voted stickers, courteous, nice. And I thought, again, I'm grateful to all these election workers. It was so easy and it was secure and I felt good about it. So I will be tracking my ballot to see if it's gotten in there and gotten counted yet.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up, but I just wanted to say, as the book outlines, the greatest threat to voting is not the handiwork of the foreign foe. It is internal to us Americans. It is the erosion of democracy that ensues when people allow themselves to become cynical about voting, when they let themselves believe that voting does not matter or that their vote won't count. So we're asking you all to go vote, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.